Greetings. Welcome to another edition of Beyond the Headlines, brought to you by the Post and Courier. I am Glenn Smith. I am the Watchdog and Public Service Editor for the newspaper, and that's a fancy title. Basically means I oversee the projects team. So some of these very long articles that you read in our paper, that's what my team works on. And one of our senior members of the team is right here with me, Jennifer Berry Hawes, who's done an amazing job over the years chronicling just great narrative stories and a lot of pieces about Charleston's tangled history. We're also going to have Gavin McIntyre, a photographer that worked on this story, be on with us. Gavin is actually racing back from an assignment because we still do work on these days, and he's running a little late, but he will join us during the program at some point. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone the event is being recorded and it will be sent out afterwards with contact info in case you have more questions you would like to direct our way. I would encourage everyone to submit questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We've already gotten a few from readers in advance of this, and they're very good questions, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. So the topic today, we're looking at the story of Denmark Vesey and a planned slave rebellion back in 1822. It's a story that's haunted Charleston for 2 centuries. 200 years ago this month, Vici was executed for the charge of attempting to raise an insurrection among the blacks against the whites. He was one of 35 men hanged that summer for the crime of trying to break free. Remember his name above others because authorities pegged him as the leader of the insurrection. For centuries, some have viewed him as a terrorist, a murderer, others as a martyr and a freedom fighter. So we're going to get started there. We're going to take you a little behind the scenes on things. Jen, 200 years after Denmark Vesey's death, he remains a significant figure in Charleston's history, with a number of events held this very month to explore his legacy. Why do you think he's remained such a seminal figure, and what made you want to dive deeper into the history books to find the truth about this controversial man?
Yeah, well, and thanks to everybody who's joining us and who read the story. Yeah, I think it really just hits at some very deep, basic human emotions. Obviously, fear, inspiration, freedom. I've been in Charleston for over 20 years, and for so long, Vici was viewed, particularly among white Charlestonians, with a lot of fear, like you mentioned, as somebody who was a would-be murderer and terrorist. And if you imagine that back in 1822, the city was a majority Black city because of the number of enslaved people who were here. So the idea of an insurrection of this magnitude really struck tremendous fear in the hearts of people who lived here, whether they were slave owners or not. And then among the enslaved population, Vici was a tremendous hero, and the people who were executed with him were as well, even if it was a story that had to be kept kind of hush-hush because people were very afraid to talk about it. So I think from both perspectives, the story generated considerable emotion. For me, I had heard about Vici. I think most of us who live here in some way, shape, or form kind of hear that story. But I became really interested in it when I first read the court records. I didn't know initially that there were these very detailed records of what happened that summer. But in fact, there are, and they're remarkable. There are hundreds of pages of explanation of what happened, of the so-called trials of the men, although we wouldn't really think of what happened as trials today, but they were called that. And these records were so detailed that I was just really fascinated. In fact, I printed out one of them and kept it in my nightstand for several years because I thought it would just make such a fascinating story one day. They detail things like meetings among the men at Vici's home, at another man named Monday Gell's shop on Meeting Street, at a farm called Bulkley's Farm. It's in the Neck area. And they talk about conversations among the men and relationships among them. And it's just really fascinating. And so I wanted to come back to it at some point in time. And the 200th anniversary really sort of opened the door to that.
You're known for writing some pretty involved narratives in which you take all these pieces of history and people's stories and meld them together in a very sort of storytelling format. To do that, you really have to have great source information, primary source information that's highly detailed to work off of, right?
Right.
And in this, oh, sorry, in this instance, you had records, I guess, which have been the subject of great debate, disputed about the veracity, how much you could trust these records because they were written from the position of the people in power, as much of history is, right? So how did you go about sort of tackling this story and weaving this all together with documents that you weren't entirely sure were on the level?
Well, it's really interesting because when I first read the court records, I didn't really think about them in terms of who wrote them. I thought they were just fascinating records with a lot of detail. And as a writer, that's super helpful because we often don't have that in history, and particularly when it comes to stories that deal with slave history. So here we had this remarkably detailed account. And then one day I ran across a journal article by an historian named Michael Johnson, who's very well known now because he was one who really, in a pretty loud way, raised concerns about these records being maintained by the white authorities of the day and asking questions about the reliability of them, given the motivations of the people who kept them. And it really made me think about that. We rely a lot, obviously, on records of people who are in power, and in this case in particular, of people who, gained or lost based on what happened. One person in particular is the mayor of Charleston, who's very integral in the story. He has political aspirations. He's more of a hardliner when it comes to things like the ability of enslaved people to work outside of the purview of their enslavers. He also is one of the first people who hears about the insurrection plans. He's very involved in the events of the summer, and then he's extremely involved in the keeping of the records. So when I sat down to write, I thought it would be really interesting to weave the debate among historians as to how much we can rely on the records with this idea of who people like Mayor Hamilton were, and present the dramatic elements of the story in the context of who wrote it. So to understand who Hamilton was and who Governor Bennett, who was another key figure. Governor Bennett, 3 enslaved people in his household were arrested in the very first wave of arrests. There's some political tug and pull there that's really interesting. So I wanted readers to understand the motives of the people involved and what they had at stake while they were reading them, so that when they read the details of these really fascinating conversations among the men or details of the plan, that they also understood the perspective they were reading through. Also, I wanted to make sure we took a look at what kind of corroborating sources are there. Several white Charlestonians wrote pretty detailed letters about what was going on. And then later on, there some Black Charlestonians also wrote accounts. So I wanted to let readers know about the different records that are available, who wrote them, so that we can have a conversation about what happened that summer with a broader sense of who kept those records and why.
So to throw this one out at you too, I mean, there were so many names in the story. Working with you on this, there were so many different names and so many different people and so many different events. And I thought you did a remarkable job of stringing it together in a way and reminding people throughout. There's also, you wove into this story this historical debate between these 3 academics, basically, that were and then the larger academic field about the dispute. And that's always challenging, right? As you're telling a story in real time, and then you're jumping in and out of the narrative, sort of taking a time machine to the present and having these different folks weigh in. How challenging was that as a writer to sort of to build that in? And why was it important to do that rather than to just write a sidebar, a separate story on what the historians had to say.
Well, again, I wanted people to understand that there was a lot of sort of tension involved in the academic debate. And then there were also a lot of really interesting characters, because we tend to think about the events of that summer through the lens of Denmark Vesey, but he was one of more than 100 men who were arrested, 35 who were hanged, dozens of others who were banished. And I also didn't want for those people's legacies to not be part of the story. And in fact, one thing that we did was ran a list of all of their names, which is, a fairly small token in a way, but it still is something that brings them into the fold, because there's so many interesting people involved. Monday, who I mentioned earlier, his shop is really sort of the epicenter of planning, according to the records. And he's an interesting man. There is a man named Gullah Jack Pritchard, who is sort of a shaman figure, also very interesting. And I wanted as much as possible to be able to discuss them and who they were, without the story becoming so unwieldy. As you mentioned, with so many names, it's hard to keep track of. But there are a lot of players. It was a huge, huge and important series of events involving a lot of people's lives. And I wanted as much as possible to be able to convey that. That it wasn't only Denmark Vesey. Obviously, he's a very important part of the story, but there were a lot of men who were important players, and I wanted to preserve that as much as possible.
Okay. I'm going to jump ahead to a question from one of the readers as we wait for Gavin here. Although it happened much earlier, what connections can we make between the Stono Rebellion and Denmark Vesey's story? Is this place of origin similar to the leaders of the Stono Rebellion? And while we know about these events, what would have been the nature of resistance generally in this era?
So the Stono Rebellion happened 1739, so a little less than 100 years before the events we're talking about with Denmark Vesey. And in that case, a group of enslaved people, this would have taken place maybe 20 miles or so to the south of Charleston. They raided an arms storehouse and then marched toward Florida, apparently trying to seek freedom in the Spanish colony there. They killed more than 20 white people. They ultimately were defeated. I believe more than 50 enslaved people died. In the aftermath of that, the state passed in 1740 a series of slave restrictions known as the Negro Act, and basically that's the law that did things like prohibited enslaved people from learning to write, from congregating, from moving about freely. And that law really served as a role model for other states who then imposed similar restrictions on their enslaved populations. But I think more specific to the 1822 events, the restrictions that were put in place were among reasons that the enslaved men involved in 1822 wanted to rise up. So one of the things that always really, I guess, sort of I related to in terms of the Vici piece was that I'm a mother, and I always thought, what would it be like to be somebody like Vici, who was able to purchase his own freedom, but then was not able to purchase the freedom of his spouse and children. And so that meant that not only could he not have any control over what happened to them in terms of their treatment, but also just that they could be sold away and sent off to a place he would never know. So if you want to understand the mindset of the summer of 1822 among enslaved people, you have to keep in mind that restrictions like the law that was passed after the Stono Rebellion certainly played a big role. And then in 1820, also the state moved to make it so that you couldn't free slaves without permission from the legislature. And so that really restricted how much someone could be freed. Vici was able to purchase his freedom after he won a lottery, but that would not have been the case to be able to purchase, for instance, one of his children without the legislature approving. And so if you think of the Stoner Rebellion is sort of something that then created restrictions that move you into the Vici rebellion. And then you can think of the Vici rebellion as moving into the Civil War. And so, there's a series of events, obviously, along that path. It's possible the Stoner Rebellion inspired some of those actors in the summer of 1822, although I don't think we know that for sure. At least I never saw anything that indicated that. But historians might have found a connection. It wouldn't be obviously, out there.
Let me ask you this. This is a good follow-up to the next, another reader question here that, as long as we're talking about finding connections. Is there any further information on the location of Denmark Vesey's grave sites? Are there any plans for restoration of his home? Do we know where they were laid to rest?
No, we don't know where any of the men who were hanged were buried or what happened to their bodies. There are some rumors that some of them may have been sort of given away for dissection. There's multiple theories about where they wound up, perhaps in the Potter's Field near MUSC, but there's not any proof that I'm aware of as of now that's out there in the public realm. And so we don't know where they're buried. And the general thinking is that was intentional, that white authorities didn't want to create a place for people to go to remember Vici or the others as martyrs and to celebrate them. In fact, people were whipped and punished if they showed any sign of mourning after the executions. So no, we don't know where they're buried. As far as Vici's home goes, we know the general location of his home on Bull Street, which is near the College of Charleston campus. And there's a marker in front of a house there now, although historians have since found that that house is not old enough to have been Vici's. So the structure that's there was not his house. And he likely lived slightly off the spot that's marked. But you can see the general location if you go to that home. Another interesting one is that the city just recently put up a storyboard where the Workhouse was. Now, the Workhouse was the place where enslaved and freed Black people were kept when they were punished for various reasons. And so Vici and the other men were kept there before their executions. Apparently they were kept also in some other sites as the Workhouse got full. But the Workhouse is now marked with that storyboard, which just happened in the past week or two. So that's certainly a step forward in terms of marking and understanding the events related to slave history, not just Vici, but including that. And so now you can go see that storyboard and see exactly where the Workhouse was. And that's pretty rare in the city. We don't have a whole lot of that. So the fact we have a marker to Vici's home and also to the Workhouse is pretty unique. Hi,
Welcome
Gavin.
to Gavin.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry,
for
had some
the
trouble
arrival.
getting on. Hey, why don't I put you on the spot right away then, since you've joined us late? Perfect. So one of the things I thought of is this is something you wanted to work on for a while, and you've also worked on some other pieces with Jennifer, kind of about the forgotten history of Charleston. In illustrating a story like this, so many of the key places and locations are gone, right? Like the Workhouse, they've disappeared from the map. They've been torn down. They no longer exist. How do you illustrate a story like this? How do you sort of take on that when you know that these things aren't, like the African church, that the original location of that is gone? How do you go about sort of portraying these things if they're not there anymore?
Yeah, it's a little difficult because obviously we want to photograph things that are present and happening now, and obviously with things in the past, especially with some locations that have been demolished or aren't there anymore or replaced with something else. It's a little difficult, but then that's also kind of part of the story. What replace the Workhouse now are homes, or for forgotten history. When we're photographing these historical locations, it's pretty telling what's there now and what isn't. They did just add a marker for the Workhouse, but there wasn't any kind of thing outside that location saying this is what was there. So I think part of it's, showing what's there now. And that's a huge thing. And it's also very interesting because, we walk by history all the time. And that's kind of what I was interested, I didn't know anything about Denmark Vesey before moving to Charleston. Even when I was living in Columbia, South Carolina, I didn't really hear about him until moving here. And so it's one of the things where we walk through, Charleston or, through other places, and we aren't really aware of what's around us, and what is there now and what used to be there. And also, one thing I think that I want to do is just people involved in the history, just because a location might not be there, there are people, involved in still telling that story, researching that story. And so that's definitely, a part of photographing it, as well as photographing people who have been involved in either maintaining it, researching it, and, keeping, for example, Vici, his legacy going.
Yeah, I thought like the drone shot you took over the old jail that sort of illustrated that. You get a sense for that location. That was a good way to do that. I've been impressed with your creativity of how you've illustrated some of these things that have just disappeared. Another key part of this thing, I remember we talked about early on, was sort of trying to make that connection between these events in the past and where we are now, and folks who have been inspired, whose life has been changed by the events back then. And you wanted to incorporate, you thought a good way to do that was to incorporate portraits of some of these folks, activists, professors, different people who've been involved. What made you want to do that and show that connection? And how did you go about choosing your subjects?
Yeah, so I think it was, a lot of the history you have, like from the trial transcripts, or, from, a certain perspective of Charleston, the white Charlestonians at the time. So I thought it was important to bring in, perspective of Black Charlestonians, who have always, seen Vici as, as a freedom fighter, someone fighting for freedom. So I thought that was important, when we're looking back on, 200 years, to bring in that view, that narrative, because that, it's not been talked about for the longest time. And so reaching out, I talked with Jennifer, and she had the great idea to also add, quotes, bring in the quotes from them to add greater context to what exactly he means to Charleston, not only Charleston, but, to freedom. I remember we spoke with Henry Darby, who played a role in getting the Vici monument put in Hampton Park. And he talked about, when Frederick Douglass was trying to get Black soldiers for the Civil War, he said, remember Vici. And so it's kind of things like that to show what exactly this means, and hearing it from someone. He talked about, being a young kid and learning about Vici for some time and wanting to honor that legacy in some way. He didn't know, obviously when he was, young, what he wanted to do, but he was always trying to find a way. And also bring in, Dr. Powers, who's been researching African-American history in Charleston for decades, and just hearing his thoughts and his view about how, the perception has changed in the city. So it's kind of reaching, in historical, finding that, historical kind of thought, but also like that more personal, idea, like what does Vici mean to you as a person? And so that was kind of the people I kind of tried to reach out to and bring into the story.
Oh, that's great.
One thing I'd add to what Gavin said with Henry Darby was that, he was talking to people like Henry would, you really see how much among Black Charlestonians that story was not shared for a long time out of fear. And I think that the 200th anniversary gave everyone an opportunity to talk more about this story. There was a number of panels and other kinds of events to celebrate Vici, which really would have been pretty unheard of maybe 20, 50 years ago in the city. So talking to people like him and hearing how that legacy's been remembered was remarkable. Also, we were able to talk to a couple of Denmark Vesey's descendants. And I think most Charlestonians don't know that his descendants are out there and that there's really a pretty large family around the Detroit area and elsewhere. But it was really neat to me anyway to go and to be able to talk with them and to sort of open the door more to hearing about his story now, when that wouldn't have been, we wouldn't have seen that, like I said, 20, 50 years ago, when Henry Darby was first starting, starting to get the monument built.
I have a couple questions that I think I could combine from people. One, are there any in-city stops or markers that featured Denmark Vesey that you know of, perhaps the monument? You can talk about also, a reader asked, do you know of any interest in having the carriage tours point out connections to our history of slavery? Jen?
I know,
Yeah,
I
go ahead.
think, I think the only, I think the only one I know is the VC monument, obviously. I don't know any other in Charleston.
Yeah, just his home, where his home is marked on Bull Street, and the Workhouse marker mentions him. I personally think there would be a lot of interest. I hear a lot of interest anyway of people who would like to see those stops noted on carriage tours and whatnot, because for so long they've, not. When I first moved to Charleston, I went to one of the local plantations, and they were referring to enslaved people as African-American artisans, and there wasn't even a mention of the fact that they were enslaved. And so the city's made a lot of progress in changing that, and certainly the carriage tours would be a way to discuss that history more openly.
Okay, hold on. So we're trying to effort this here. We actually have a couple descendants of Denmark Vesey who had agreed to join us today, something we normally don't do on the program, is sort of loop in a bunch of outside folks, but we thought it'd be very helpful. We're going to try to endeavor to get them on. I think this is Michelle Vesey right here. So we're trying to endeavor. It's Michelle Vesey and Malvina Smith.
And I think Malvina may be sick today, so I don't know if she'll be joining us.
Hello, how are you?
Hey,
Hello.
great.
I'm Michelle Vici. Can you see me?
We sure can, yes. We weren't sure. We
Okay.
saw the phone on the list of participants. We weren't sure. There's a few Michelles in the group today, so we weren't sure if it was you. I'm glad you could join us.
Yes, it's my pleasure to be here with you. You were mentioning portraits that were instilled into your work, and behind me is a portrait of Denmark Vesey, which my father had commissioned a few years before he passed away. I'm going to try and zoom in on it for you. Can you see that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, since we don't know of any picture of him. It's interesting to see that.
Yes, my father had it commissioned, and it was compilated from several different pieces of documents that we had as family history, but none of them were quite clear. So my father and his sisters and brothers compilated all of them together and rendered them to the artist who created this portrait for us.
Oh, that's neat. Let me ask you, Michelle, how is Denmark Vesey remembered in your family?
He is notably stated as our 5th great grandfather, but that would, from my parents' point of view, so that would make him, as a descendant, be my 6th great grandfather. And we always had the story from very young. I can remember being told the story as a toddler, but at that time it was in the 60s, and we had no validation or proof. It was just a family lore. And my dad used to say, well, you got away with it again, because I wrote many, many school papers in history and social studies and science relating to my ancestor, Denmark Vesey. And coming from an area that was pre-segregation for the schools, the Detroit public school system, I wasn't really welcomed as an outspoken descendant of a Black historic figure. So I wrote this paper in just complete rejection of what was going on at the time. And I wrote them many times. And my father would always say, you know, we don't have any documentation. But once it all came out and it was actually verified and the documentation became available to us, as I was telling Jennifer, a lot of times revealing these things throughout historic documentation is not easy for Black people, because we are still discouraged from reviewing or researching these things. And in my childhood, there was no such opportunity to have these documents available to us. We could not go to Charleston and say, I want to see that.
Yeah.
So sometimes it is, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, in Jen's story, she documents in a few points about how the event was, the hangings and all, was so fear-inspiring. People were so terrified after that you just didn't talk about this whole thing, and that it became passed down in oral tradition, but very quietly, because you didn't want to be heard talking about Denmark Vesey in Charleston. Sounds like you encountered some similar things in Detroit.
Exactly. It wasn't particularly the event or Denmark Vesey individually. It was a discouragement from trying to represent or present an individual of color as a historic figure. The only mention of him I ever saw it throughout my formal education was in a 3rd grade textbook. And they mentioned him in along with a statement about Nat Turner. And they did not mention them as strong abolitionist position holders, but more of a side note. And they actually pronounced him more a horse thief than an abolitionist. And he said he and Nat Turner were said to be abolitionists, but were hung as horse thieves. That is very discouraging for a child that carries that name. To put that label on your ancestor wasn't a hero, he was a horse thief. And I ran into that many times, even in today's time, when I mention my ancestry and how great a man Denmark Vesey was. Even Black people are shocked to say, I didn't know that. I said, it's deliberate. It was not taught. It was not shared, especially among Blacks, because they didn't want us to know. They did not want us to have a sense of pride and entitlement to freedom and pride.
Well, what does it mean to your family now? What does it mean to you personally that he is so widely recognized now? There's been books about him, all sorts of discussion and academic debate. I mean, in Charleston and beyond.
It's a point of jubilee for us as a family. We are all so excited and finally validated in what we've known to be our history since I was born and before. The trail itself from Charleston to where we stand is not as detailed as the history of what Denmark did, how he was able to work amongst the free people and how he was able to use his earnings to buy a lottery ticket. And that money he was able to buy his freedom with. And I can remember my father and my grandmother telling me how frustrating and how enraging it was for him to be a free man and have the means to do so, but not be allowed to free his family. And I understood it as a child and even more as an adult. When you have the ability to complete a task, but you are being prevented from doing it, that broods and festers in your system. It is very notable why he would be at the pinnacle involved in planning a resurrection, because he had everything that they said was necessary to get his family. You just need, at that time in America, you could buy a Black person from anybody if you had the money. And he had the money. He wanted his family, and he was denied that right.
Michelle, would you tell the story you shared with me about coming to Charleston for the dedication of the monument and what it was like coming to the city from Detroit and the experience of seeing the monument and being here in this place where all this happened?
Well, we weren't actually there at the dedication. I misspoke. We went down a couple of years later at a pilgrimage, you might say, a busload of our family members. I personally went at the last minute, so I followed the bus with my 2 sons in my car. But when we arrived there, it was like very, very stoic being in a southern city. Now, the heat was ridiculous because we went in the summertime, but being there and going to the statue itself, we were led by Mr. Darby, and it was just so very surreal to be standing in a place and walking in a place and feeling the historic vibe. It was a moment of pride for me personally, but it was also very painful to be standing on the same ground in which I could imagine my people were beat here and my people were forced to work here. And the historic moment itself and being able to see the actual recognition of his fame and his contribution to the ending of slavery was overshadowed by the pain of the actual amount of suffering and turmoil that was endured by an entire culture for all of those years in that city, and standing in the beautiful park with all the luxurious scenery to look at and still having that gnawing at my core that this was made by us, this was built by us, and we were beat and treated mercilessly while it was being done. A group of family members were taken by another tour guide over to the Workhouse and to see the station where the sales actually took place. And I couldn't go. It was too painful for me. I stayed at the hotel. I'm much more intuitive to the emotional parts of what's going on than others.
And on a happier note, one thing I thought was really neat was your family reunions. Would you talk a little bit about that and how often you get together and what it's like to be with all these other descendants?
Well, pre-COVID-19, we gathered every 3 years and had it's called the Vici family reunion. My grandmother's maiden name and her side of the family were the Wrights out of Washington State. But our reunions are held every year, and we go back as far as Denmark, well, every 3 years until COVID, as far as Denmark, and tell the stories that we remember. And we have 6 or 7 generations at that function, from the great grands and up all the way down to the youngest child. They're all present, and we are communing as a historic family and sharing our story and what we went through, and how my grandparents came up here with nothing and what she called a gaggle of children and built a life. And they have always been politically motivated and activist in their own right. My grandmother was part of, was the pinnacle individual who forced the city of Detroit to make the first playground in Black Bottom for the children to play in, because she was afraid of them being hurt playing around the stockyards and things. And that type of activity has always been a part of our family history. If you see something, do something, is how we were brought up. And I believe it is based on the fact that you can't stop someone from reaching their true ability as long as that person believes in themselves. And that's what we were taught about Denmark Vesey. Yes, he was born a slave. Yes, he traveled the world as a slave. But when he had the opportunity to do so, he gained his freedom and he fought for the freedom of others.
And to clarify for people who are listening, your lineage goes to Denmark through his son, Robert, correct?
Yes.
And Robert was a son who was not charged in relation to the conspiracy, but who after the Civil War was involved in designing Emanuel AME Church's first wooden structure, which was destroyed by the earthquake. And so they rebuilt, but that son who you're related to was involved in building Emanuel, which is obviously a very historic church here, in the site of the mass shooting in 2015. But that it's through him that you're connected with Denmark, correct?
Yes, that is correct. There are several members of our family living in the Chicago area that are also descendant of Robert, and it is told that we came up through the regular what they call the trail to the north after slavery ended, and there was the Great Depression, and my grandparents came forward to Detroit area after the Great Depression, bringing their children with them, and there are also some that went on to Chicago.
Oh, okay.
And that's how we've always had the story told to us. It has always been represented to us, but until it was acknowledged and validated throughout the community, thanks to the educational members like yourself and Douglas Egerton, who have made their point in bringing this forward. We didn't have validation. We just had our story. Now our story is really confirmed as not just our story, but his story.
And Doug, for those who don't know, he's one of the historians in the story that we wrote. He's one of the most prominent historians studying Vici. He and another professor wrote a book that really brings all of the various court records and letters and all kinds of other primary source documents into one place. And they put it in a book that they released a few years ago. So for those who are interested in really seeing the breadth of documentation out there, that book is a really excellent resource.
All right. Well, we've gone a little beyond, and it was good because we were able to get Michelle on there. Thank you so much for calling in and joining us. Really great to hear your voice.
Appreciate you. We are very grateful as a family that you all have taken this up as a banner and continue to investigate and bring forth the truth. Thank you all very much.
Sure. I want to thank Michelle. I want to thank Jennifer and Gavin and all of you in the audience for tuning in today. I know I didn't get to a couple of your questions, just ran out of time. And if you want, you can email us directly. There'll be information on how to do that. We'd be happy to answer those. Remember, you can sign up for any of our free newsletters as well, postandcourier.com/newsletter sign up. If you're a subscriber, we'd like to say thank you very much. If you're not a subscriber, you can also sign up at postandcourier.com/subscribe. So thank you. Until next time, have a great week.